Deep in the Blackscale Mountains, where autumn mist clings to jagged stone teeth and the wind carries whispers from forgotten graves, a hiker's boot struck something that should not have been there. Half buried beneath decades of fallen leaves lay a rusted military button, its eagle insignia worn smooth by time and weather. But it was what lay beside it that made her hands tremble as she brushed away the dirt, a human femur yellowed with age and carved with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in the dappled forest light. In the winter of 1874, men vanished into these same mountains. They emerged months later with hollow eyes and a terrible secret that would bind them for generations. What no one realized was that their ordeal had not ended with their rescue. It had only begun. Deathbed confessions spoke of rituals that defied God and nature. Records vanished from official files. Entire families disappeared from the frontier, leaving behind only whispered rumors of a covenant written in flesh and bone. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. The investigators who finally uncovered the truth discovered something far worse than cannibalism, born of desperation. They found evidence of a systematic creed, a religion of consumption that fed on human lives for decades. This was not just crime, this was an operation that transformed survival into sacrament and men into something unrecognizable. The carved femur was not alone in the forest that October morning. Within arm's reach lay fragments of a military coat, its brass buttons green with verdigris, and beneath a rotting log, the rusted remains of what appeared to be a mess kit. But it was the bone itself that defied explanation. The patterns etched into its surface were not random scratches from scavenging animals. They were deliberate, ritualistic, carved with the precision of a craftsman who had time and reverence for his work. The discovery sent ripples through the archaeological community, but it was the last will and testament of Armitage Finch, filed in 1903 and gathering dust in a county clerk's office, that provided the most chilling context. Finch, a disgraced Pinkerton agent, had spent his final years investigating disappearances in the remote settlements of the Blackscale Mountains. His handwritten testament, discovered by researchers only decades later, contained allegations that would have been dismissed as the ravings of a broken man, were it not for the physical evidence now emerging from the forest floor. According to Finch's account, the men of the Iron River Battalion had not simply resorted to eating their dead during that brutal winter of 1874. They had embraced it. They had ritualized it. They had carried it home with them to the isolated settlement of Bitterwood, where it became the foundation of a secret covenant that would endure for generations. His final entry, written in increasingly erratic script, claimed that he had witnessed preparations for what the residents called the Second Supper, a ceremony from which women and children were barred, and from which the participants emerged with a terrible peace in their eyes. The official records tell a different story, of course. The Iron River Battalion was rescued in April of 1875. Their survivors praised in the local newspapers for their remarkable endurance and high morale despite their ordeal. Commander Elias Thorne was celebrated as a hero, his leadership credited with keeping his men alive when lesser officers might have lost them all to starvation and despair. The few casualties were attributed to disease and exposure, their bodies respectfully interred at Fort Gilead before the battalion's triumphant return to civilian life. But Finch's investigation uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Supply records that ended abruptly before the pass was truly impassable. Medical journals describing not the emaciated survivors of a siege, but men who appeared well-nourished and strangely exultant. Census data from Bitterwood showing impossibly low mortality rates for such an isolated community, and always the whispered stories of travelers who ventured too close to the settlement and were never seen again. What disturbed Finch most was not the evidence of cannibalism itself, but the systematic nature of what he discovered. This was not the desperate feeding of starving men, but something far more calculated. His notes describe finding carved bone implements, ritualistic arrangements of remains, and testimony from the few escaped residents who spoke of ceremonies conducted by moonlight, with prayers that inverted the sacred mysteries of communion. The carved femur found that October morning bore markings identical to those described in Finch's reports. The same swirling patterns, the same careful craftsmanship, the same terrible reverence. It was as if the forest itself had finally exhaled, releasing the evidence of horrors that had been buried for more than a century. But to understand how a military unit could transform into a cannibal clan, we must first journey to the place where their legend began and never truly ended. The Blackscale Mountains rise from the western frontier like the spine of some ancient, slumbering beast, their jagged peaks scraping storm clouds perpetually pregnant with snow. Even in summer, the valleys remain shrouded in mist, their depths concealing secrets that the sun has not touched for generations. It is a landscape designed by nature to swallow men whole, to erase their passage without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The Continental Westward Expedition had charted these treacherous passes by 1874, marking them on hand-drawn maps, with the precision of men who understood that a miscalculated turn could mean the difference between glory and an unmarked grave. The route to Fort Gilead wound through Stone Tooth Valley, a narrow gorge flanked by walls of iron-rich rock that gleamed blood-red in the setting sun. The pass itself was a marvel of natural malice. Barely wide enough for a supply wagon, it twisted through the mountains like the track of some enormous serpent. Local tribes avoided the region, speaking in hushed tones of spirits that dwelt among the stone teeth, hungry ghosts that fed on travelers foolish enough to venture into their domain during winter's dark months. The blood-red pass, so named for mineral deposits that stained its walls the color of dried gore, became completely impassable once early snows began to fall. The narrow defile would fill with drifts 20 feet deep, creating a barrier as impenetrable as any fortress wall. Supply caravans learned to make their final runs before October's end, for any wagon caught after the first blizzard would remain until spring thaw turned the route into a treacherous river of mud and ice. Fort Gilead was less a military installation than a collection of log buildings huddled for mutual protection against howling winds. The post's commander had warned expedition leaders repeatedly about wintering in the valley. His stores were barely sufficient for his own garrison, much less an entire battalion. These warnings were noted in official correspondence, filed with careful bureaucracy that would later provide damning evidence. The letters detailed contingency plans, supply schedules, the precise tonnage of provisions required to sustain 120 men through a mountain winter. What they do not explain is why these provisions never arrived, why the final supply train turned back 20 miles from Fort Gilead, its manifest noting only that the mission had been canceled by direct order of Commander Elias Thorne himself. By November of 1874, the blood-red pass had sealed the Iron River Battalion inside Stone Tooth Valley as effectively as if they had been entombed alive. The wind carried promises of months of isolation, hunger, and decisions that would test the very foundations of civilized behavior. Into this frozen maw marched 120 men. Less than half would return as they were. The Iron River Battalion was not assembled through the typical military recruitment of strangers bound by duty alone. When the Continental Westward Expedition issued its call for volunteers in the spring of 1874, the response from Millfield County was overwhelming and troubling in its uniformity. Entire extended families enlisted together, fathers alongside sons, cousins marching beside uncles, creating a military unit that resembled less an army battalion than a clan migration. The muster roll tells the story in stark detail. Of the 120 men who answered the call, 93 bore one of just 3 surnames: Thorn, Crow, or Rook. These families had intermarried for generations in the isolated valleys of Millfield County, creating a web of blood relations so complex that many of the soldiers were connected by multiple lines of kinship. Brothers served under cousins who had married their sisters. Fathers took orders from sons-in-law who were also their nephews. Commander Elias Thorne stood at the center of this genealogical maze, a man whose charisma was matched only by his unsettling intensity. At 42, he was older than most military commanders of his rank, his delayed advancement attributed by some to his unorthodox ideas about soldier loyalty and unit cohesion. Thorne believed that blood ties created stronger military bonds than mere training and discipline. He spoke frequently of the ancient warrior societies, of how tribal loyalty had sustained fighting men through hardships that would break conventional armies. His philosophy attracted followers among the isolated communities of Millfield County, families who had learned self-reliance through generations of frontier hardship. These were not men who looked to distant authorities for guidance or salvation. They trusted their kin, their traditions, and their leader with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. When Thorne spoke of forging a new kind of community in the Western Territories, a settlement built on the foundations of proven bloodlines and shared sacrifice, his listeners heard not the dreams of a visionary, but the practical wisdom of survival. Dr. Alistair Vance represented one of the few outsiders welcomed into the battalion's inner circle. A skilled surgeon with a reputation for unorthodox medical practices, Vance had treated the Thorne family through several difficult births and epidemic illnesses. His inclusion in the expedition served dual purposes, providing necessary medical expertise while also binding him to the group through obligation and shared secrets. Vance's journals, discovered decades later, reveal a man increasingly uncomfortable with his role, yet unable to extricate himself from commitments that grew more binding with each passing month. Corporal Jedediah Crow, Thorne's quartermaster and record-keeper, brought to the battalion the methodical precision of a man accustomed to managing scarce resources. The Crow family had operated general stores throughout Millfield County for 3 generations, developing an almost supernatural ability to stretch supplies and find profit in the most marginal circumstances. Jedediah's ledgers would become legendary among military historians, not for their accuracy, but for their careful documentation of transactions that should never have been recorded. Young Silas Rook, barely 19 when the expedition began, represented the 3rd generation of blacksmiths in his family line. His inclusion in a military unit might have seemed unusual until one considered Thorne's long-term vision for the group. A community needed more than soldiers. It needed craftsmen, builders, men who could work metal and wood into the tools of civilization. Silas brought with him not just his skills, but his family's collection of specialized tools, implements that would prove disturbingly versatile in the months to come. The battalion's younger members showed the effects of their isolated upbringing in ways that disturbed the few outsiders who encountered them during training. They displayed an unsettling uniformity of thought and expression, finishing each other's sentences and responding to unspoken signals with the coordination of a flock of birds. Army regulars who observed their drills noted that the men seemed to anticipate orders before they were given, moving with a collective purpose that transcended normal military discipline. What struck observers most forcefully was the battalion's attitude toward death and sacrifice. During training exercises that simulated battlefield casualties, the men displayed an unusual calmness when handling the wounded and dead. They spoke of fallen comrades not with the sorrow typical of soldiers, but with a reverence that bordered on envy. Death, in their lexicon, was not defeat but transformation, not ending but beginning. This was not a random group of men thrown together by military necessity. It was a family bound by generations of shared blood, shared beliefs, and shared isolation from the broader world. And when a family is threatened, it will do anything to protect its own. The snow began falling on November 3rd, 1874, 2 weeks earlier than any recorded storm in the region's brief written history. By November 10th, the drifts had sealed the blood-red pass as effectively as a stone wall, cutting the Iron River Battalion off from the outside world with a finality that seemed almost deliberate. It was during this period of growing isolation that Private Isaiah Crowe, Jedediah's youngest nephew, began exhibiting the first signs of the fever that would claim his life. Dr. Vance's journal entries from this period reveal a physician increasingly concerned not just with his patient's deteriorating condition, but with the battalion's reaction to the unfolding tragedy, where he expected to find the typical military response to illness, the grim acceptance of mortality that characterized frontier life. He instead encountered something that disturbed him profoundly. The men seemed to view Isaiah's suffering not as misfortune but as opportunity. Commander Thorne visited the sick man daily, conducting what he described as counseling sessions, but which bore little resemblance to the spiritual comfort typically offered to the dying. Instead, according to Vance's careful observations, these conversations focused on themes of sacrifice, transformation, and the eternal bonds that connected the living and the dead. Thorne spoke of cycles, of how death in one form enabled life in another, of how the fallen could continue to nourish and sustain their brothers even after their spirits had departed. Isaiah Crowe died on November 19th, his fever breaking not into recovery, but into the final stillness that Dr. Vance had witnessed countless times before. What followed, however, was unlike anything the physician had previously encountered. Rather than the subdued mourning typical of such occasions, the battalion gathered for what Thorne described as a celebration of Isaiah's transition. The commander delivered a eulogy that spoke not of loss, but of Isaiah's continued presence among them, his transformation from burden into blessing. The burial took place the following morning, conducted with military precision but accompanied by rituals that seemed to draw from sources far older than Christian tradition. The grave was dug in the rocky soil behind Fort Gilead, shallow by necessity given the frozen ground, but marked with careful arrangements of stones that formed patterns reminiscent of the carved bone implements later discovered in the ruins of Bitterwood. Dr. Vance noted in his journal that the men seemed unusually eager to participate in the interment, displaying none of the reluctance typically associated with such grim duties. It was 3 weeks later that the first disturbing reports began to circulate among the battalion. Soldiers on patrol claimed to have seen movement near Isaiah's gravesite, not the scavenging of wild animals, but deliberate systematic disturbance of the burial mound. When Corporal Crowe investigated, he found the grave partially excavated, the carefully arranged stones scattered, and unmistakable signs that the body had been accessed and disturbed. The official explanation recorded in both military logs and Dr. Vance's journal attributed the desecration to wolves driven to desperation by the harsh winter. Such incidents, while disturbing, were not unknown in frontier regions where wildlife faced starvation alongside human populations. The grave was resealed, additional stones were placed to discourage further animal interference, and the matter was considered closed. But the whispers among the men told a different story. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones of seeing figures moving in the darkness, of hearing the sound of digging when no work details had been assigned, of catching glimpses of their comrades engaged in activities that defied both military protocol and moral understanding. Most disturbing of all were the subtle changes observed in the battalion's younger members, who had begun to speak of Isaiah not as a fallen comrade, but as a continuing presence among them. Dr. Vance's journal entries from this period reflect his growing unease with the situation. His medical training had prepared him to deal with death as a clinical reality, but the battalion's response to Isaiah's passing suggested something far more troubling than grief or even desperation. The men looked resolved, purposeful, as if the young private's death had confirmed, rather than contradicted, some fundamental belief about the nature of survival and sacrifice. The first death was a tragedy. The ones that followed would become something else entirely. 25 years passed before the shadows of that terrible winter reached beyond Stone Tooth Valley. By 1899, Bitterwood had established itself as a model of frontier prosperity, its residents known for their self-sufficiency and remarkable longevity. The community attracted little attention from authorities, paying taxes promptly and causing no trouble. To observers, the Thorns, Crows, and Rooks had transformed military discipline into civilian success. The promise of mineral wealth brought William Pembroke to the remote valley that autumn. The young geologist, fresh from Eastern universities and armed with surveying equipment, had been commissioned to assess the region's mining potential. His letters home spoke optimistically of copper deposits and silver veins that could transform the territory's economic prospects. Pembroke's disappearance on October 15, 1899, initially caused little concern. He had been warned about the dangers of solo surveying in remote terrain as winter approached. His failure to return from a 3-day reconnaissance was attributed to misfortune that claimed unprepared travelers with regularity. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly conducted a perfunctory search around Bitterwood. His report concluded that the geologist had fallen victim to mountain wolves growing bold as game became scarce. Torn fabric and scattered equipment near a ravine seemed to confirm this theory, satisfying officials eager to close an uncomfortable case. But the Pembroke family possessed the resources and connections to demand thorough answers. William's father, a prominent banker, was not satisfied with assurances that his son had simply been unlucky. He hired private investigators and eventually settled upon Armitage Finch as the man most likely to uncover the truth. Finch arrived carrying the weight of professional failures. Once among the Pinkerton Agency's most capable investigators, he had been dismissed following a scandal involving falsified evidence. His reputation in ruins, Finch viewed the Pembroke investigation as his final opportunity for redemption. The family's generous retainer would sustain him for months. His first impression of Bitterwood struck him as contradictory. The settlement displayed frontier prosperity, well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, and well-fed residents. Yet something was unsettling in how conversation stopped when he approached, in the careful politeness that concealed underlying wariness. Children playing in the street would disappear into houses, only to reappear at windows watching him with unblinking intensity. The settlement's prosperity seemed unnatural for such a remote location. Most frontier communities struggled with basic necessities dependent on irregular supply trains. But Bitterwood showed no such dependence. Its stores were well-stocked, residents well-dressed, buildings maintained to impressive standards. More disturbing was the community's response to questions about William Pembroke. Without exception, residents claimed no knowledge of the geologist's visit. This struck Finch as implausible, given that Pembroke would have passed through Bitterwood to reach his surveying sites. The coordination of their responses suggested not ignorance, but careful preparation. Before we continue deeper into this investigation, take a moment to subscribe if you want to uncover the darkest secrets that communities will kill to protect. As Finch settled into temporary quarters at the settlement's boarding house, he understood that his investigation would require subtle methods. The residents had clearly been warned of his arrival and coached in their responses. Their politeness masked a defensive solidarity, suggesting they were protecting something far more significant than privacy. What unsettled Finch most was realizing he was not investigating a simple disappearance, but challenging an entire community's commitment to silence. Every interaction, every neutral response, every quick denial suggested the residents were bound by agreements that transcended normal loyalty. Armitage Finch came to Bitterwood looking for one missing man. He would soon realize the entire settlement was dedicated to ensuring some people never got found. What Finch could not have understood during those first unsettling days in Bitterwood was that he had stumbled upon the final evolution of a system that had been perfected over 25 years of practice. The rituals that bound the community together had their origins in that terrible winter of 1874, when starvation and isolation had transformed desperate men into something unrecognizable. During the siege at Fort Gilead, as supplies dwindled and the death toll mounted, Commander Thorne had made a decision that would echo through generations. Rather than allowing his men to succumb to despair or resort to the chaotic cannibalism that had destroyed other isolated groups, he imposed structure upon their horror. What began as survival became ceremony. What started as necessity was transformed into sacrament. According to Dr. Vance's increasingly disturbing journal entries, the process followed rigid protocols that Thorne claimed were inspired by ancient warrior traditions. When a member of the battalion died, whether from disease, exposure, or the injuries that became more common, as malnutrition weakened their bodies, the deceased was not buried immediately. Instead, the body was brought to what Thorne called the sanctification chamber, a root cellar beneath Fort Gilead that had been cleared and prepared for this grim purpose. Young Silas Rook, despite his youth, possessed the metalworking skills necessary to create the tools required for their new practices. Working by candlelight, in the depths of winter, he forged implements that served purposes no frontier blacksmith should have been asked to contemplate. Knives designed for precise cuts, hooks for hanging, containers for collection and storage. Each tool was crafted with the same care and attention to detail that he had once reserved for horseshoes and plow blades. The actual ceremony, as described in fragments of correspondence later discovered in the ruins of Bitterwood, combined elements of military protocol with rituals that seemed drawn from sources far older than Christian tradition. Commander Thorne would lead prayers that spoke of transformation and eternal bonds, of how the fallen could continue to nourish and sustain their brothers even in death. Dr. Vance, despite his growing revulsion, was required to participate in his capacity as the battalion's surgeon, ensuring that the process was conducted with medical precision. Corporal Crow's role as quartermaster took on dimensions that would have been incomprehensible to military authorities. His ledgers from this period, written in a code that would not be broken until decades later, meticulously documented the distribution of what he euphemistically termed provisions. Each entry recorded not just quantities but the source of the materials, the methods of preparation, and the careful rationing that ensured the battalion's survival through the darkest months of their ordeal. What distinguished Thorne's system from the random acts of cannibalism that had occurred in other desperate situations was its emphasis on meaning and purpose. This was not the frenzied feeding of starving animals, but a deliberate act of communion that bound the survivors together with ties stronger than blood. Every man who participated became complicit. Every mouth that consumed the sanctified remains became party to a secret that could never be shared with the outside world. When spring finally arrived and the Blood-Red Pass reopened, the surviving members of the Iron River Battalion faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could return to civilization carrying their terrible secret, living with the knowledge of what they had done to survive, or they could embrace what they had become and build a community founded on the bonds that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. Rather than dispersing to their former homes and families, the survivors chose to remain together, establishing the settlement of Bitterwood in a location remote enough to ensure that their practices would remain undisturbed. Here, in this isolated valley, they could continue the rituals that had become the foundation of their brotherhood, transforming survival cannibalism into a religious creed that would bind their descendants for generations. The tallow candle burning in a front window became the signal that the covenant was gathering. Children learned to recognize this sign and knew to remain indoors, understanding without explanation that certain activities were not meant for their eyes. Women, too, were excluded from the inner circle, though some, like the wives of the original battalion members, understood enough to maintain the silence that protected their community's darkest secret. The meeting house that served as Bitterwood's church during daylight hours transformed after sunset into something far different. Here, the surviving members of the Iron River Battalion and their male descendants would gather to participate in rituals that honored their fallen comrades and renewed their commitment to the covenant. The communion they shared was unlike any practiced in Christian churches, drawing its elements from sources that would have horrified conventional believers. This was no frenzied feast. It was a liturgy written in flesh and bone, and every ritual needs a high priest. It was on his 5th morning in Bitterwood that Armitage Finch encountered the woman who would change everything. Mary Thorne moved through the settlement like a ghost made flesh, her hollow eyes fixed on some distant horror that only she could see. The other residents spoke of her with careful reverence, referring to her condition as a burden she had carried since her husband's death 3 winters prior. But there were moments when Mary's mind seemed to surface from whatever depths had claimed it. During these episodes of clarity, she would hum fragments of old hymns, melodies threading through the settlement like half-remembered prayers. It was during one such moment that she noticed Finch watching her from across the main thoroughfare. Their first conversation took place in the shadow of the meeting house, where Mary had been arranging wildflowers in patterns that seemed random but followed geometric principles suggesting deeper meaning. When Finch approached, she looked up with eyes that held terrible lucidity, as if the fog clouding her thoughts had momentarily lifted. Her voice carried the weight of years of suppressed testimony. She told him about the signals that summoned men to nocturnal gatherings, about tallow candles that burned in windows when the covenant was called to session. She described sounds that drifted from the meeting house after midnight, rhythmic chanting that seemed to follow patterns older than any Christian liturgy. But it was her description of what she called the Second Supper that made Finch's blood run cold. Mary spoke of meals that followed official community dinners, private gatherings from which women and children were strictly excluded. She had witnessed the preparation of these ceremonies, had seen her husband's face as he returned from rituals that left him with an expression of terrible peace, a satisfaction that transcended normal human contentment. The most disturbing aspect was not the evidence of cannibalistic practices, but how these rituals changed the men who participated. Her husband had returned from each second supper somehow different, more distant from ordinary concerns, but more closely bound to his fellow participants. The covenant members moved through daily routines like actors performing familiar roles, but their true selves emerged only during those midnight gatherings. Mary's exclusion from these ceremonies had become a source of growing isolation within her marriage. Her husband would speak of matters she could not understand, would reference shared experiences that remained forever beyond her reach. The women of Bitterwood lived as outsiders in their own community, permitted to observe surface activities but forever barred from the deeper mysteries that bound their men together. As her testimony continued, Mary began exhibiting signs of distress that had marked her behavior since her husband's death. Her hands trembled as she described finding him in their bedroom after a particularly significant covenant gathering, his face bearing such profound satisfaction that she initially assumed he was experiencing religious ecstasy. Only later did she understand that his death had been anticipated, even welcomed, as the final step in his participation in the community's darkest ritual. The revelation that shook Finch most came when Mary described artifacts the Covenant members created to commemorate their fallen brothers. Working with materials she dared not name, the community's craftsmen carved intricate patterns into implements that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. These objects were distributed among surviving members as tangible reminders of their shared bonds. From her worn shawl, Mary withdrew a small object that caught the morning light with the pale luminescence of old bone. It was a button carved from what appeared to be human remains, its surface decorated with the same swirling patterns that would later be discovered on the femur found by modern hikers. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each curve executed with master precision, but the material transformed beauty into horror. As she pressed the button into Finch's palm, Mary's brief clarity began to fade, the fog of her affliction settling once again over her features. But her final words carried a warning that would haunt the investigator. "The men of the Covenant," she whispered, "did not simply honor their dead through ritual consumption. They prepared for their own eventual participation in the ceremony, viewing death not as an ending but as the ultimate expression of their commitment to the community's survival." The button felt unnaturally warm in Finch's hand, as if it retained some essence of the person from whom it had been carved. As Mary drifted away, humming fragments of hymns that sounded increasingly like dirges, Finch realized he now possessed not just testimony, but physical evidence of the horrors that Bitterwood had worked so carefully to conceal. With Mary's testimony, Finch now had a key, but a key is useless without a lock to put it in. Armed with Mary, Thorne's testimony, and the carved bone button, Armitage Finch made a decision that would transform his investigation from passive observation into direct confrontation. The carved implement provided enough justification to demand official cooperation from local authorities, who had shown little interest in pursuing the Pembroke case with meaningful vigor. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly received Finch's request with poorly concealed irritation. The sheriff had built his career avoiding complications that might attract territorial attention, and Finch's insistence on searching private property threatened the delicate balance that kept Bitterwood's affairs from official scrutiny. Nevertheless, Donnelly could not ignore the evidence Finch presented. The bone button, with its intricate carvings and unmistakable human origin, represented physical proof that could not be dismissed as easily as witness testimony. Faced with the possibility that his failure to act might be discovered by higher authorities, the sheriff agreed to accompany Finch on what he insisted would be a brief examination of the settlement's public buildings. Their first target was Silas Rook's smithy, the logical location for tools connected to carved bone artifacts. The blacksmith received their arrival with sullen cooperation, understanding that resistance would invite greater scrutiny. He stood aside as they examined his workshop, his ice-blue eyes following their movements with unblinking intensity. The search revealed nothing immediately incriminating. Rook's tools were typical of any frontier blacksmith, designed for shoeing horses and crafting mundane metalwork. Yet Finch noticed disturbing details. Certain knives showed wear patterns inconsistent with normal metalworking, their edges bearing marks from cutting materials softer than iron or steel. More troubling was the forge itself, which showed evidence of use beyond conventional smithing. The intense heat could serve other functions that would leave no obvious traces but might explain the settlement's remarkable ability to dispose of materials other communities would have been forced to bury or burn. Their examination of the meeting house proved equally frustrating in its apparent normalcy. The interior showed hallmarks of a typical frontier church, with rough-hewn benches and a simple altar, but Finch detected subtle anomalies suggesting the space served purposes beyond conventional worship. The floor showed wear patterns implying regular rearrangement of furniture, as if the normal configuration was frequently altered for different gatherings. Certain areas displayed faint discolorations that spoke of repeated exposure to substances ordinary church services would not produce. Most significantly, the basement revealed modifications designed to muffle sound and provide privacy for activities requiring absolute secrecy. The walls had been lined with timber that would absorb noise, and the entrance fitted with a door, whose thickness suggested it prevented both sound transmission and unauthorized access. Despite these suggestive details, the search produced no definitive evidence linking the meeting house to practices Mary Thorne had described. Sheriff Donnelly, eager to conclude the investigation, declared himself satisfied that nothing criminal had been discovered and suggested Finch's suspicions were based more on imagination than fact. The investigator's frustration was compounded by realizing his activities had been observed by numerous residents who watched with the careful attention of people evaluating a threat. The coordinated surveillance suggested word had spread quickly throughout the community, and appropriate preparations had been made to ensure nothing genuinely incriminating would be discovered. That evening, as Finch reviewed his notes in his boarding house room, the sound of breaking glass shattered the settlement's quiet. A rock lay among scattered window fragments, wrapped with paper bearing a message written in careful script. The note's words were few but unmistakable. "Leave. The winter is coming." The phrase carried implications beyond its literal meaning, referencing not just the approaching season, but the community's shared memory of that terrible winter, 25 years earlier when their current practices had been established. As Finch examined the rock and its warning, he understood his investigation had crossed a threshold from which retreat might no longer be possible. The residents had revealed their capacity for direct action, and their message suggested his continued presence would be met with escalating resistance. The Covenant had shown its teeth, but Finch had one last place to look, the one record they could not falsify. The Territorial Archives occupied a single room above the general store in Cedar Falls, the nearest settlement with sufficient bureaucratic infrastructure to maintain official records. The clerk, Ezra Holbrook, had spent 2 decades filing correspondence and military reports with obsessive precision, understanding that history lives or dies in the accuracy of its documentation. Finch arrived carrying the weight of mounting frustration. The threatening message had made clear his time in Bitterwood was limited, yet he lacked evidence substantial enough to justify the risks he had taken. His reputation, already damaged by previous professional failures, could not survive another case ending in speculation rather than proof. The Iron River Battalion's files occupied 3 wooden boxes, stored in the archive's deepest shelves, their contents gathering dust. Finch spread documents across the reading table, creating a timeline that began with the battalion's formation and ended with their triumphant return to civilian life. Early records painted a picture of military efficiency and proper planning. Commander Thorne's correspondence demonstrated thorough understanding of logistical challenges involved in maintaining a battalion through a mountain winter. His supply requests were detailed and realistic, accounting for transport difficulties and the possibility that weather might prevent regular resupply operations. What struck Finch was the abrupt change in tone during the final weeks before the Blood-Red Pass became impassable. Thorne's earlier communications had emphasized the critical importance of establishing adequate supply lines before winter weather made mountain routes unusable. Yet his final correspondence, dated days before the pass was expected to close, canceled the most significant supply shipment of the entire operation. The cancellation order provided no explanation for this dramatic reversal. The supply train assembled to sustain the battalion through winter months was dismissed with terseness, completely inconsistent with the commander's earlier attention to detail. More troubling, the cancelled shipment included not just food and ammunition, but medical supplies and winter clothing essential for survival. Corporal Crow's ledgers told an even more disturbing story. The quartermaster's records initially followed standard procedures for documenting receipt and allocation of provisions. But beginning in November 1874, entries shifted to notation that defied conventional military accounting practices. Where previous entries recorded specific quantities of flour, salt pork, and hardtack, November records spoke of provisions acquired through what Crow euphemistically termed local sourcing. The quantities were impossibly precise, documenting weights and measurements, suggesting a level of processing care inconsistent with the desperate circumstances the battalion supposedly faced. Most chilling were entries from December and January, when the battalion should have been consuming remaining supplies at accelerated rates as starvation set in. Instead, Crow's ledger showed steady acquisitions of fresh provisions, with distributions carefully calculated to maintain personnel health and morale. The mathematics of survival told a story contradicting every official account of their ordeal. Finch cross-referenced supply records with casualty reports, looking for correlations that might explain the discrepancies. The pattern that emerged was systematic and horrifying. Each death within the battalion was followed, within days, by corresponding entries documenting acquisition of fresh provisions. The quantities matched with disturbing precision the estimated yields a quartermaster might expect from processing what military terminology coldly classified as available organic resources. His examination of territorial census records provided the most damning evidence of the conspiracy sustaining Bitterwood for decades. The settlement's mortality statistics showed death rates impossibly low for such an isolated community. Disease, accident, and normal frontier hazards should have claimed lives with predictable regularity, yet Bitterwood's records suggested a community where death was remarkably rare. More significantly, census records showed no official burials after 1875. The settlement's small cemetery contained graves from the community's earliest years, but no markers indicated interments from the period when former battalion members had established permanent residence. Either Bitterwood residents had achieved unprecedented health and longevity, or their dead were being disposed of through methods leaving no official documentation. The final piece transforming suspicions into certainty came from an unexpected source. Buried among routine territorial correspondence was a brief inquiry from a federal marshal investigating missing persons in the region surrounding Bitterwood. The marshal's letter mentioned 3 separate cases of travelers who had disappeared while passing through the area, their fate attributed to mountain travel hazards, despite evidence suggesting they had reached the settlement safely. The marshal's investigation had been curtailed by territorial authorities who insisted federal intervention was unnecessary. Case files were closed without resolution, but their existence provided official recognition that Bitterwood had been the last known location of multiple missing persons over several years. As Finch assembled these documents into a comprehensive timeline, he understood he had uncovered proof of a conspiracy stretching back more than 2 decades, encompassing not just Bitterwood residents but territorial officials who had chosen to ignore inconvenient evidence rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The records pointed to an impossible truth. The starvation was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy. Armed with documentary evidence that could no longer be dismissed as speculation, Armitage Finch made the decision that would seal his fate in Bitterwood. The archive records had provided proof of Commander Thorne's deliberate sabotage, But Finch understood that evidence without confession would never be sufficient to expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had sustained itself for 25 years. The walk to Elias Thorne's house felt like a journey into the heart of something ancient and malevolent. The commander's residence occupied the highest ground in Bitterwood, offering commanding views while remaining partially concealed by pine trees, whose branches reached toward the structure like protective arms. The building was larger and more substantial than other homes, its construction reflecting the prosperity the former battalion members had somehow achieved. Thorne received his unexpected visitor with the calm composure of a man who had been expecting this confrontation for years. At 73, the former commander retained the erect bearing and penetrating gaze that had once commanded desperate soldiers. His hair had gone white, but his eyes remained the same piercing blue that had mesmerized his followers during that terrible winter decades earlier. The interior reflected the strange duality characterizing all aspects of life in Bitterwood. The main room was furnished with frontier practicality, yet subtle details suggested wealth and refinement, inconsistent with the community's supposed isolation. Books lined shelves crafted with master carpenter skill, and oil lamps provided illumination, speaking of access to luxury goods difficult to obtain in such a remote location. Finch's accusation came with the directness of a man who had exhausted diplomatic approaches. He laid out evidence systematically, documenting canceled supply orders, coded ledger entries, impossible survival statistics, and the pattern of disappearances that had marked Bitterwood's existence for decades. He spoke of cannibalism transformed into religious ritual, of a community bound by shared participation in horrors transcending normal human experience. Thorne's response came not as denial or outrage, but as calm acknowledgement of facts he treated not as accusations but as recognition of his greatest achievement. The former commander spoke with measured tones of a teacher addressing a promising but misguided student, explaining concepts requiring perspective and wisdom to understand. According to Thorne's account, the decision to cancel the final supply shipment had not been born of madness, but of vision. He had recognized the opportunity presented by approaching winter not as a crisis to endure, but as a crucible in which he could forge a new kind of human community. The starvation that followed had been deliberately orchestrated to break down social conditioning that bound his men to conventional morality and loyalties. The cannibalism beginning with Private Isaiah Crow's death had served as the foundational ritual of what Thorne described as a purification process. By compelling his followers to cross the ultimate moral boundary, he had freed them from civilized constraints and created bonds of complicity that could never be broken. Men who had shared such profound transgression could trust each other in ways conventional relationships never achieved. The community of Bitterwood represented the culmination of Thorne's grand design, a settlement populated entirely by individuals who had proven their commitment to survival above all other considerations. Here, freed from outside judgment, they could live according to principles that prioritized community continuation over individual squeamishness or moral objections. As Thorne spoke with absolute conviction, Finch became aware of subtle changes in the atmosphere surrounding the house. Normal evening sounds had gradually faded, replaced by ominous silence that pressed against windows like a living thing. Shadows that had not been present when he arrived now moved beyond the glass, suggesting figures positioned to observe the proceedings. The realization that he was no longer free to leave came as gradual, understanding that he had walked willingly into a meticulously prepared trap. The front door, which he had entered freely, was now secured by a heavy wooden bar that had been silently positioned while Thorne held his attention with disturbing revelations. Sounds from outside grew more distinct as additional figures took positions around the house. Finch could distinguish deliberate footsteps of men moving with military precision, their coordination suggesting planning and practice that transformed a simple confrontation into a carefully choreographed operation. Thorne's final revelation came with casual indifference of a man discussing livestock yields. The silver deposits that William Pembroke had been surveying were not theoretical possibilities but proven resources secretly extracted by the community for years. The wealth generated by this mining operation had funded Bitterwood's prosperity and ensured the loyalty of territorial officials who found it profitable to overlook irregularities. The cannibalism that had begun as survival necessity and evolved into religious ritual had ultimately become the foundation of a criminal enterprise, generating substantial profits while maintaining absolute security through the participants' shared complicity. Every Covenant member was bound not just by ritual participation, but by financial dependence on an operation that could not survive exposure. Trapped in the lion's den, Armitage Finch finally understood the full horror. He was not investigating a crime, he was trespassing on a religion. What happened next would shatter every assumption Finch had made about the nature of evil. As the investigator sat trapped in Thorne's parlor, surrounded by sounds of armed men taking positions outside, he expected to hear the confession of a madman driven to cannibalism by desperation. Instead, he witnessed something far more disturbing: the calm exposition of a philosophy that had transformed horror into virtue through the simple expedient of redefining the terms. Thorne rose from his chair with deliberate movements, moving to a wooden cabinet that dominated one wall. From within its depths, he withdrew a leather-bound journal whose pages bore careful script of someone who understood that his words might someday serve as the founding document of a new form of human organization. The journal contained his complete philosophy, the intellectual framework that had guided every decision from that first canceled supply order to the community's current prosperity. The revelation that followed struck Finch like a physical blow. The cannibalism that had begun during the siege at Fort Gilead had not been the desperate act of starving men driven beyond civilized boundaries. It had been the first sacrament in a deliberately constructed religion, a ritual designed to bind his followers through bonds of shared transgression that could never be severed by conventional moral considerations. According to Thorne's account, the decision to engineer the battalion's starvation had emerged from years of studying military units under extreme stress. He had noted that soldiers who survived horrific experiences together formed relationships transcending normal human connections. But these bonds remained vulnerable to time and changing circumstances. What Thorne sought was something more permanent, more binding than mere shared suffering. The answer had come in the form of what he described as the ultimate test of commitment. By compelling his men to participate in acts violating the deepest taboos of their society, he would create a community bound not just by mutual dependence, but by mutual complicity. Men who had crossed such profound moral boundaries together could never betray each other without destroying themselves. The ritual consumption of Private Isaiah Crowe had served as the prototype for what would become the central mystery of the Bitterwood Covenant. But Thorne's genius lay not in the act itself, but in the theological framework he constructed around it. Drawing from extensive reading in comparative religion and ancient history, he had created a cosmology that transformed cannibalism from abomination into sacrament, from crime into communion. The men who participated in these rituals, Thorne insisted, were not monsters but pioneers, individuals courageous enough to transcend artificial moral constraints that kept ordinary humans trapped in weakness. By consuming the flesh of fallen comrades, they were not desecrating the dead but honoring them, ensuring their strength and wisdom would continue to nourish the living. But Thorne's next revelation exposed the true scope of his deception. The rescue that arrived in spring 1875 had not discovered survivors of a tragic siege. It had encountered graduates of a carefully orchestrated initiation, men transformed through shared experience into something transcending ordinary human loyalties. The official accounts of their heroic endurance had been deliberately crafted to conceal the true nature of their ordeal from authorities who would never have understood the revolutionary implications. Yet even this religious framework had served as concealment for something more pragmatically motivated. The silver deposits that William Pembroke had been surveying were not recent discoveries but resources the community had been exploiting for years through methods requiring absolute secrecy. The wealth generated had funded not just Bitterwood's prosperity, but a network of bribes extending throughout territorial government. The missing geologist had stumbled upon evidence of mining operations that officially did not exist, conducted by people who officially had no access to such resources. His death had been necessitated not by cannibalistic hunger but by the simple need to protect a secret that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable income annually. The cannibalism that had begun as engineered survival necessity and evolved into religious ritual had ultimately become the perfect cover for a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope. Every ritual participant was bound not just by shared transgression, but by financial dependence on an operation that could not survive external scrutiny. As Thorne closed his journal and returned it to the cabinet, his final words carried absolute conviction. The cannibalism was not the desperate secret they were trying to hide. It was the sacred banner they rallied around. The real secret was far more mundane and far more profitable. The confrontation in Elias Thorne's parlor ended not with violence, but with something far more chilling. A negotiated surrender that left no witnesses and no evidence. Armitage Finch found himself escorted from Bitterwood under cover of darkness, his notebook confiscated, his future made contingent upon his willingness to accept the official version of events that would be filed with territorial authorities. The terms of his release were presented as practical considerations. His reputation as a discredited Pinkerton agent would ensure any accusations would be dismissed as desperate fabrications of a man seeking to salvage his professional standing. The Pembroke family, already satisfied with the official explanation, had no interest in funding further investigations that might prove embarrassing to their social position. Sheriff Marcus Donnelly proved remarkably cooperative in crafting the final report that would close the Pembroke case permanently. The document concluded that William Pembroke had fallen victim to mountain travel hazards, his remains discovered in a remote ravine where they had been scattered by scavenging animals. The evidence was described in sufficient detail to discourage inquiry, while remaining vague enough to prevent verification. Finch's own final report painted a picture of thorough investigation, frustrated by frontier realities. He had found no evidence of foul play, no indication that Pembroke had encountered anything more dangerous than natural hazards that claimed countless travelers. The family accepted his findings with the resignation of people transforming grief into memory. The broader implications would remain buried beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and official convenience. Territorial authorities had no interest in allegations that would require acknowledging the inadequacy of their oversight, particularly when investigations might reveal the extent to which local officials had been compromised by financial considerations, making willful blindness more profitable than diligent law enforcement. Yet the consequences of Finch's investigation extended beyond immediate suppression. The residents of Bitterwood, reminded of their vulnerability to external scrutiny, began the gradual dissolution that would erase their community from both landscape and historical record. The decision prioritized long-term security over preserving their unique social experiment. The dispersal began in 1904 with families quietly selling properties to buyers who asked few questions. Official records show voluntary relocations motivated by economic opportunities, families seeking better prospects or more favorable climates. No single departure attracted attention, but the cumulative effect was systematic evacuation of a community that had once numbered nearly 200 souls. The buildings that remained told no disturbing stories to casual observers. The meeting house was dismantled board by board, its materials repurposed for distant construction projects. The smithy was abandoned to elements, its specialized tools removed by unknown parties. Even the cemetery was carefully tended, its modest headstones providing no indication that the community's approach to death had deviated from convention. By 1910, Bitterwood existed only as a name on territorial maps, applied to a valley where foundations and debris marked locations of buildings whose purposes had become subjects for archaeological speculation rather than historical record. Travelers reported finding nothing more remarkable than typical ruins of failed frontier settlements defeated by isolation, weather, or economic factors. The silver deposits that had motivated such secrecy were eventually discovered by legitimate mining operations, though yields proved disappointingly modest. The veins that had generated substantial profits for the Bitterwood Covenant were largely played out by the time official development began, leaving only enough precious metal to justify small-scale operations that attracted minimal attention. With the settlement empty and the participants gone, the legend of the Iron River Battalion should have faded into myth. But the land and the bones have a long memory. The carved femur that emerged from the forest floor in October of 2023 was not the first artifact to surface in the ruins of what had once been Bitterwood. Over the decades since the settlement's abandonment, hikers and amateur archaeologists had occasionally reported finding objects inconsistent with the official history of a failed frontier community. Fragments of carved bone, metal implements of unusual design, stone arrangements suggesting ritualistic rather than practical purposes. These discoveries had typically been dismissed by academic authorities as products of overactive imaginations or misidentified remnants of indigenous activities predating European settlement. The few artifacts reaching university collections were catalogued as items of uncertain provenance, filed away in storage facilities where they gathered dust alongside countless specimens that defied easy classification. But the internet age had transformed amateur investigation in ways territorial officials could never have anticipated. Online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, true crime investigations, and historical mysteries provided platforms where scattered reports could be compiled, compared, and analyzed by individuals whose curiosity was not constrained by academic caution. The modern rediscovery of the Bitterwood mystery began with a blog post by urban explorer Marcus Chen, who had documented his visit to the ruins with photographs capturing details overlooked by previous investigators. His images of foundation stones arranged in geometric patterns, combined with close-ups of carved symbols etched into surviving timber fragments, attracted researchers who recognized similarities to artifacts from other sites associated with ritual activities. Chen's documentation enabled virtual investigations by people who would never physically visit the remote valley. Digital analysis revealed details invisible to the naked eye, tool marks suggesting systematic processing of organic materials, wear patterns on stone surfaces, indicating repeated use for activities leaving no obvious traces, alignments between structural remnants implying purposes beyond simple shelter. The breakthrough connecting modern discoveries to historical records came from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a graduate student researching territorial period military units. While digitizing archival materials, she encountered references to the Iron River Battalion in documents never properly catalogued. Her investigation of discrepancies between official records and surviving correspondence uncovered the same contradictions that had troubled Armitage Finch more than a century earlier. Martinez's digital databases allowed her to cross-reference military records with census data, territorial correspondence with newspaper archives, official reports with private journals donated to historical societies by descendants with no understanding of their significance. The patterns emerging from comprehensive analysis demanded explanation. The collaboration between Martinez's historical research and Chen's archaeological documentation attracted paranormal investigators less concerned with academic rigor than with generating compelling content. Their expeditions to the Bitterwood ruins, documented through social media videos, claimed to have recorded unexplained phenomena, suggesting the location retained connection to activities that had once taken place there. More disturbing were reports of ritual activities echoing the practices of the original Bitterwood Covenant. Park rangers and Forest Service personnel had begun finding arrangements of animal bones and carved stones, suggesting contemporary visitors had attempted to recreate ceremonies based on their interpretation of historical accounts. These modern rituals, while lacking systematic organization of their 19th century predecessors, demonstrated that ideas pioneered by Elias Thorne retained their power to influence behavior across generations. The discovery of the carved femur in 2023 represented the culmination of decades of gradually intensifying interest in the Bitterwood mystery. Unlike previous artifacts, this bone fragment was documented with sufficient precision to enable scientific analysis, confirming its human origin and establishing its age as consistent with the settlement's operation period. For the first time, physical evidence existed that could potentially validate the most disturbing allegations about the community's practices. Yet even this tangible proof failed to generate official acknowledgement of what had transpired in the remote valley. Law enforcement agencies cited jurisdictional limitations and statute of limitations, constraints preventing formal investigation of crimes allegedly committed more than a century earlier. The rituals may have ended, but the patterns they carved into this place seemed to repeat, waiting for someone new to learn the steps. In the end, we are left with fragments, testimony that cannot be verified, documents that may have been forged, artifacts whose origins remain disputed by experts who have never agreed on anything more controversial than catalog numbers. The story of the Iron River Battalion exists in that shadowy realm where history becomes legend, where fact bleeds into folklore, and where the absence of proof becomes its own form of evidence. Armitage Finch's investigation, dismissed by his contemporaries as the desperate fantasies of a discredited agent, has found new life in the digital age where every document can be analyzed, every photograph enhanced, every connection mapped with precision that would have astounded 19th century investigators. Yet for all our technological advantages, we remain no closer to definitive answers than Finch was during those terrifying nights in Bitterwood. The carved bone artifacts continue to surface in the ruins, each discovery generating renewed speculation among researchers who cannot agree whether they represent evidence of cannibalistic rituals or elaborate hoaxes designed to perpetuate a legend that has grown more compelling with each retelling. Scientific analysis confirms their age and human origin, but science cannot penetrate the intentions of those who created them. The financial records that might have provided concrete evidence of the silver mining operation have vanished, if they ever existed outside of Thorne's alleged confession to a terrified investigator whose testimony was recorded by no one. The territorial archives contained gaps and inconsistencies that could indicate either systematic cover-up or simple bureaucratic incompetence, phenomena often indistinguishable in their effects. What we can say with certainty is that the Iron River Battalion existed, that they survived a harsh winter at Fort Gilead, and that they subsequently established the settlement of Bitterwood, which prospered for approximately 30 years before being mysteriously abandoned. We know that travelers disappeared in the region, that official investigations were cursory, and that the community's dissolution coincided with increased external scrutiny. But there is one piece of evidence that cannot be explained away by skeptical analysis or dismissed as overactive imagination. In a peaceful cemetery 200 miles from the ruins of Bitterwood, surrounded by conventional markers of a prosperous frontier community, stands a granite headstone that bears the name of Elias Thorne, commander of the Iron River Battalion, beloved father and devoted leader who died peacefully at age 87. The epitaph carved into that stone was chosen by Thorne himself, according to cemetery records that have survived intact despite the mysterious disappearance of so many other documents. The words are simple, carved in the plain style favored by frontier communities that valued substance over ornament. Yet their meaning, once understood in the context of everything we have learned about Bitterwood, transforms a conventional memorial into something far more disturbing. The inscription reads, "He fed his flock." To most visitors, these words would suggest nothing more remarkable than the pious sentiments of a community leader remembered for his charitable works and spiritual guidance. The biblical reference would be recognized by anyone familiar with Christian scripture, calling to mind parables of the Good Shepherd and imagery of pastoral care. But for those who have delved into the darker possibilities of Thorne's legacy, the epitaph takes on implications that stretch conventional interpretation. Was this the final confession of a man who had spent decades concealing the true nature of his community's survival? Was it a coded message for those who understood the real meaning behind Bitterwood's prosperity? Or simply the choice of an old man whose sense of humor had grown increasingly dark with age? The headstone stands in its neat row among dozens of similar markers, weathered by decades of mountain winters but still clearly legible to anyone who takes the time to read it. Cemetery visitors occasionally pause to examine the inscription, perhaps wondering about the story behind such an unusual epitaph, but they invariably move on without grasping the terrible possibilities hidden within those 4 simple words. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe now, because history's darkest secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. In the end, we are left only with the words they chose to be remembered by, and the terrifying possibility that, for them, it was never a confession, but a testament of faith.